a suitcase unzipped, hands spread wide. A voice, low and firm, saying, "Step aside, sir." The airport hummed with the usual sounds of travel rolling luggage, flight announcements, hurried footsteps, but in this moment, everything felt still. Marcus Hayes knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it before, felt it before, lived it before. The so-called random check. The watchful, unreadable gaze of the security officer. The way time stretched, turning seconds into minutes, minutes into a missed flight. He knew the script by heart. But this time he wasn't going to let it slide. He looked at the officer, Agent Willis, badge gleaming, stance firm. The confidence of a man who had never had to explain himself before. Marcus' voice was steady when he asked, "What's the reason for this additional screening?" Willis didn't blink. Routine procedure. That was the lie they always told. But bad luck doesn't have a pattern. And injustice never hides as well as it thinks. Marcus had spent years fighting cases just like this, standing in courtrooms, exposing discrimination, holding power accountable. But today he wasn't the lawyer. He was the case. And the question was, what happens when the man who defends the system finds himself trapped inside it? Before we dive into the story, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, hit like, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because this fight is just getting started. Marcus Hayes had always believed in moving through the world with purpose. His stride was confident, his posture upright, his presence one that commanded quiet respect. He had spent years perfecting that balance, being firm without being threatening, assertive without being aggressive. It was a dance he had learned as a child, one his father had drilled into him in quiet conversations at the kitchen table. "You have to be twice as good, son," his father had said. The weight of those words pressing down even when Marcus was too young to fully understand their meaning. Now, standing in the heart of the airport, surrounded by the hum of movement, the rolling luggage, the announcements crackling overhead, Marcus was just another traveler in a well-tailored suit, briefcase in hand, ticket tucked neatly inside. The flight to Chicago was on schedule, and he had a case to argue in the morning. A big one. A case that could set a precedent, change laws, reshape lives. He had planned every moment of his trip with precision, the timing, the seating, the hotel a short ride from the courthouse. But some plans unravel before they even begin. "Sir, could you step over here, please?" It was a voice he'd heard before, not in sound but in tone, the kind that wrapped itself in official language but carried something else beneath it. He turned to face the TSA agent, a stocky man with a square jaw and a gaze that had already sized him up before the words had left his mouth. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level, his expression unreadable. "Routine check," the agent said, gesturing toward a separate screening area. Marcus glanced at the clock overhead. 52 minutes until boarding. He had time, but not for this. Still, he knew better than to push back. He set his briefcase down, removed his belt and shoes, and walked through the scanner. The machine gave no sound, no red light, nothing to indicate an issue. And yet, the agent stepped forward, hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Step aside, sir. We need to do an additional screening." Marcus inhaled slowly, measured. He had argued in front of federal judges, cross-examined witnesses who had everything to lose, faced down opposing counsel who would do anything to see him fail. But this was different, because here, in this moment, he was not Marcus Hayes, Esquire. He was not the man who had built his name on winning the unwinnable cases. He was a black man in an airport, standing in front of an authority figure who had already decided something about him. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice controlled. The minutes stretched. Other travelers, the ones who had arrived after him, moved through security with ease. A man in a golf polo, his gray hair neatly combed, nodded at the agent, who waved him through with a chuckle. A woman in yoga pants and sneakers, balancing a coffee cup in one hand, was barely glanced at before she continued on. But Marcus stood and waited. His heart beat a slow, steady rhythm, but his mind raced. He thought of the briefcase with his case files, the documents inside that needed his attention. He thought of his mother, who still called him every time he traveled, reminding him to be careful as if she sensed the invisible threats that lurked in places like these. "Hands out, sir." The agent's voice was clipped, impersonal. Marcus complied, palms up, fingers spread. The agent patted him down with the thoroughness of someone looking for something they wanted to find. "You traveling for business?" the agent asked, the words casual but the intent sharp. "Yes," Marcus replied, offering nothing more. "What kind of business?" Marcus hesitated. He knew the answer would shift the air between them. "I'm an attorney." The agent's eyes flickered just a fraction, but Marcus caught it. A shift, a calculation. "Where you headed?" "Chicago." "For what?" "Work." He could have elaborated. He could have told him about the civil rights case, about the firm that had sent him, about the judge who would be expecting him in the morning. But he didn't, because in that moment it wouldn't have mattered. The agent studied him a moment longer, then motioned toward the screening table. "Take a seat. We're running an additional check." The words were like weights pressing down, not in sound but in implication. Marcus glanced at the clock again. 36 minutes until boarding. "How long will this take?" he asked, his patience thinning. "Shouldn't be long," the agent said, but there was no reassurance in his tone. Marcus sat. He watched travelers pass. He watched time slip through his fingers. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before, not just to him, but to men who looked like him, to women who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, to those who had asked too many questions or not enough. And this was where the real test lay, not in the courtroom, not in front of a jury, but here in the quiet way power moved, in the way it held you in place while the rest of the world carried on. He exhaled, slow, steady. He had missed flights before, but he had never lost. The clock on the airport wall flickered, a digital reminder that time moved forward even when Marcus Hayes remained trapped in place. 29 minutes until boarding, but he had already made peace with what he knew deep down he wasn't getting on that plane. The weight of that truth settled in his chest, but he refused to let it crush him. Instead, he watched, observed, filed every detail away like evidence in a case not yet called to trial. The security checkpoint still buzzed with its usual rhythm. Families shepherding children through the scanner, business travelers clutching their boarding passes like talismans, agents waving some people through with barely a glance while others like him were pulled aside, slowed, questioned. There was a pattern here, one Marcus had learned to recognize long ago. The agent in front of him, Willis, the name stitched onto his badge, wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't trying to be efficient. He was trying to make a point, though he'd never say it outright. That was the thing about moments like this. They were built on the unspoken, on a language older than the laws Marcus spent his life defending. The slow unzipping of his bag, the methodical pat-down, the way Willis asked the same questions in different ways, as if he were searching for an inconsistency, a slip. "So, you're an attorney," he repeated, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. "What kind of law?" Marcus measured his breath, forced himself to hold steady. "Civil rights." He let the words hang, let them settle between them. Willis didn't react, not outwardly, but Marcus caught the slight pause in his hands, the way his fingers tightened ever so slightly on the edge of the tray before releasing. "I see," Willis said finally, like the answer had confirmed something for him. Marcus wanted to laugh. "No, you don't see. You don't see the cases I've fought, the people I've defended, the families who have sat across from me in small rooms with trembling hands and hopeful eyes, waiting for me to tell them that the law would protect them. You don't see the nights I spent studying until my vision blurred, the trials where I stood before juries who had already made up their minds before the first witness spoke. You don't see the conversations my father had with me at the kitchen table, his voice low and steady as he prepared me for the day I'd stand exactly where I am right now. No, Willis, you don't see." But Marcus had learned long ago that saying these things out loud wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't get him on that flight. It wouldn't undo the way the world worked. So instead, he waited. 24 minutes until departure. The younger agent, the woman who had been standing off to the side, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at Marcus, then at Willis, then back again. Something in her expression softened. "Sir," she said hesitantly, stepping forward. I think we've checked everything. Willis cut her off with a sharp look, and she shrank back, her mouth snapping shut. Marcus saw it then, the power dynamic, the invisible chain of command. She knew this wasn't right, but knowing and acting were two different things. How many times had Marcus seen that same hesitation in a courtroom? How many times had he watched good people stay silent because they were afraid of what speaking up might cost them? He let out a slow breath. Am I free to go? Willis didn't answer right away. He took his time, too much time, before finally nodding. Yeah, you're clear. Marcus grabbed his bag, slipped his shoes back on, collected his things. He moved deliberately, not rushing, not letting them see even a flicker of the frustration simmering just beneath his skin. He glanced at the clock again. 19 minutes. It wasn't enough. The flight was at the far end of the terminal, and security had done its job. Not the job it claimed keeping people safe, but the job it truly excelled at. Reminding him of his place, making sure he knew that no matter how far he climbed, how many cases he won, how much respect he earned, there would always be moments like this. Still, he walked toward his gate, not because he thought he would make it, but because he refused to let them see him defeated. As he moved through the terminal, past the shops and restaurants and the clusters of travelers lost in their own worlds, his mind turned to what came next. He could let it go. He could shake it off, board another flight, get to Chicago late and do his job as if nothing had happened. But then what? He had spent his career fighting battles for other people, but wasn't this a battle too? How many others had stood in that same security line, faced that same smirk, missed their flights not because of what they had done but because of who they were? His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, saw his assistant's name flashing on the screen. He already knew what she was going to say. He pressed the call button. Marcus, they just called final boarding. I know, he said. A pause. Then softly, I'm sorry. Marcus stopped walking. He looked out over the terminal, the thousands of people moving in different directions, all on their way somewhere. He tightened his grip on his phone, the weight of the moment settling over him. He thought of his father's words, of the generations before him who had faced worse, who had kept walking anyway. He thought of all the times he had stood in front of a judge, fighting for someone else's right to be seen, to be heard. No, he wasn't letting this go. He straightened his shoulders, turned on his heel, and started back the way he came. The wheels of his suitcase hummed against the tile floor as Marcus Hayes moved back toward security, his mind sharpening like a blade. He had spent his life arguing for justice, standing in courtrooms where words were weapons and facts were armor. But this was different. There was no judge in a robe, no jury waiting to be persuaded. There was just a checkpoint, a line, and a man in a uniform who had already decided that Marcus didn't belong on that flight. It would have been easy to walk away, to let it go, to tell himself that missing one flight was nothing in the grand scheme of things. But Marcus knew better. He knew that the moment you stop pushing back, the moment you accept that injustice is just part of the way things are, is the moment they win. He wasn't in the habit of letting anyone win without a fight. Willis was still there, standing with his arms crossed, the same smug expression on his face, the one that said he had done his job, that he had controlled the situation just as he intended. The younger officer, Agent Tran, her badge red, stood nearby, eyes flickering between Marcus and her superior, her face tight with something that looked like regret. She knew what had happened wasn't right. But knowing and acting weren't the same thing, and Marcus understood that hesitation all too well. How many times had he sat across from clients who had swallowed their voices, afraid to speak up, afraid of what it might cost them? He had spent his career convincing people to fight. Now it was his turn. He stopped in front of Willis, his posture straight, his voice steady. I need your full name and badge number. Willis barely blinked. Excuse me? You heard me, Marcus said, pulling his phone out of his pocket, tapping the screen open. You detained me without cause, forced me to miss my flight, and as far as I can tell, there was no legitimate reason for it. So I'm going to need your full name, your badge number, and the name of your supervisor. Willis let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind that men like him use when they think they've already won. Sir, we followed standard protocol. Marcus tilted his head slightly, watching him the way a seasoned lawyer watches a witness about to step into their own trap. Which protocol was that? The one where you pulled me aside for extra screening without explanation? The one where you ignored every other traveler who walked through that scanner? Or the one where you wasted 40 minutes of my time so I would miss my flight? Willis's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Marcus took a step closer. You see, I know the law. I know that if I request identification from the officer who detained me, I have the right to that information. I also know that TSA has strict policies about racial profiling. So, unless you want me to escalate this, I suggest you provide your details now. Agent Tran shifted her weight, her lips pressing into a thin line. Marcus caught the flicker in her expression: recognition, maybe even relief. The moment where someone sees that justice might not be so far out of reach after all. Willis squared his shoulders, but Marcus could see the hesitation creeping into the edges of his confidence. Sir, if you'd like to file a complaint, you're welcome to contact TSA directly. I already plan to, Marcus said smoothly, but let's make sure I get your information correct before I do. Willis hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he pulled out his identification and recited his details, his voice flat, like a child forced to apologize. Marcus recorded it, each number and syllable locked into place. The balance of power was shifting now, and they both knew it. Thank you, Marcus said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Now, I'd also like a record of my detainment. That's public information, and as a lawyer, I know exactly how to request it. For the first time, Willis looked slightly uncomfortable. The thing about power was that it worked best in the dark, in silence, in places where people didn't push back. Marcus had just turned on the lights. Agent Tran cleared her throat, and for the first time, she spoke. Sir, she said, her voice measured, careful, but with something firm underneath. If you'd like to step over here, I can assist you with that request. Marcus turned to her and nodded. She wasn't his ally, not yet, but she was someone who might be willing to do the right thing if given the chance. Sometimes that was all it took. He followed her toward a small desk off to the side, where she pulled up the system and started typing. I'm going to print the incident report, she said quietly, keeping her eyes on the screen. It will include the reason for secondary screening, time of detainment, and officer notes. Marcus studied her for a moment. You knew this wasn't right. Her fingers hesitated on the keyboard. A beat passed, then another. I don't make the decisions, she said finally, her voice low. But you see them. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Marcus nodded, letting the silence speak. He didn't need her to say it out loud. He already knew. He had met too many people like her in too many different places, people caught between doing what they were told and doing what they knew was right. The printer whirred. She pulled the papers and handed them to him. Thank you, Marcus said, meaning it. She hesitated. Then, just before he turned to leave, she spoke again, barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. He gave her a long look, then nodded once. So am I. Marcus walked away with the report in one hand, his phone in the other. He had everything he needed now. He might have missed his flight, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Some fights happen in courtrooms, some happen in boardrooms, and some happen right here in the middle of an airport, in a place where people expect you to keep your head down and move along. But Marcus Hayes wasn't built for silence. He was built to fight, and fight he would. The night air was thick when Marcus stepped out of the airport, the weight of the incident pressing against his chest like a stone. The city hummed around him, oblivious, indifferent. Traffic pulsed along the roads, headlights slicing through the darkness. People moving in and out of terminals, pulling luggage, hugging loved ones, rushing toward destinations that had not been stolen from them. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the cool air, but the tension in his shoulders refused to loosen. He had been here before, not in this exact place, not in this exact moment, but in the feeling, the sick, familiar sense that no matter how much you build, how high you climb, there will always be someone standing at the door, telling you that you don't belong. And it never happens in a way you can put your finger on. Never with words as blunt as, you can't be here. It happens in the slow erosion of time, The delays that aren't really delays, the smiles that don't reach their eyes, the questions that should never have been asked in the first place. He slid into the back seat of a cab, gave the driver his home address, and pulled out his phone. He should have been landing in Chicago by now, reviewing his case notes in a quiet hotel room, preparing for a morning that could define the life of the man he was defending. Instead, he was here, scrolling through his contacts, knowing exactly who he needed to call. The dial tone rang twice before Ava picked up. Her voice was sharp, alert, already knowing something was wrong. "Marcus, they made me miss my flight," he said, his voice steady, controlled, though his pulse still thrummed with frustration. "TSA pulled me for extra screening with no reason. Kept me there just long enough to make sure I wouldn't get on that plane." Silence. Then a slow inhale from the other end of the line. "Did you get names?" "Willis. Badge number in my notes. I have the incident report. I recorded the conversation. And there was another agent, Tran. She knows it was wrong. I don't think she'll go on record, but she hesitated. She wanted to." "Good," Ava said, and he could already hear her mind working, assembling the puzzle pieces, mapping out the next steps. "We make a formal complaint. File for the records. Request the security footage before it mysteriously disappears. If we find a pattern, if Willis has done this before we go public." Marcus exhaled, his grip tightening on his phone. "He's done this before," he said, because he knew. Because it was never just one time, never just one bad apple. It was a system that let men like Willis stand at checkpoints with unchecked power, knowing they could wield it however they pleased. Ava's voice sharpened. "Then we find proof." The cab rolled through the city, streetlights stretching shadows across the pavement. Marcus leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling, the anger simmering just beneath his skin. He had built his career on fighting cases just like this, but it had been a long time since he had been the one sitting in the chair, the one being questioned, delayed, dismissed. And maybe that was why this cut so deep, because for all the progress, for all the victories, the truth remained. You could be brilliant, you could be accomplished, you could wear the best suit in the room, and none of it would save you when someone decided you were a problem. "We don't let this go," he said, more to himself than to Ava. "We push." "Damn right we push," she said. "I'll start pulling case files first thing in the morning. You get some rest." He nodded, though he knew he wouldn't sleep. Not tonight. The cab pulled to a stop outside his building, and Marcus stepped out, feeling the quiet weight of the city settle around him. He looked up at the night sky, dark and endless, and let himself feel the exhaustion for just a moment. Then he turned, walked inside, and began to prepare for the fight ahead. Because there was always another fight. Because nothing changed unless people made it change. And because no matter how many doors they tried to close in his face, he had never been the kind of man who waited for permission to walk through. Morning broke in a slow stretch of golden light across the city, spilling through the tall windows of Marcus Hayes' apartment, illuminating the stacks of legal briefs and half-drunk cups of coffee left abandoned from the night before. He had not slept. Sleep was a luxury when you were preparing for war, and make no mistake, this was war. Not the kind waged with fists or fire, but the kind that played out in courtrooms, across news headlines, in the spaces where policy was written and rewritten, where the truth was bent until it fit into something palatable for those who never had to fight to exist. He sat at his desk, scanning the TSA report for the third time, looking for the cracks. And they were there, like they always were, hidden between the lines of bureaucratic jargon, carefully chosen words meant to make their misconduct sound routine. Additional screening conducted per standard security procedures. A phrase designed to conceal the truth, to make what happened to him seem normal, just another part of the process. But Marcus knew better. He had spent his career exposing the way words were used to justify power, how policies could be shaped into weapons when placed in the wrong hands. His phone buzzed. "Ava, I've got something," she said the moment he answered.
No greeting, no preamble.
That was how they worked, direct, efficient. "Willis, the agent who detained you. This isn't the first complaint." Marcus leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone tighter. "How many?" "Enough to establish a pattern," she said, and he could hear the satisfaction in her voice. 2 separate cases filed in the last year, both citing unnecessary delays, extended questioning, and failure to provide legitimate cause. And get this, one of the complaints was from a federal judge. Marcus let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against the desk. That was the thing about men like Willis. They didn't stop at one. They got comfortable. They got bold. They pushed until someone pushed back. "We go public," he said. "Agreed," Ava replied. "I've already drafted a statement. You'll want to look it over, but I say we get this in front of the right people today. We control the narrative before they do." Marcus nodded, already opening his laptop. "I'll call a few reporters. See who's willing to dig. Make it count," she said, and the line went dead. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. This was how change happened, not in grand, sweeping moments, but in the quiet persistence of refusing to let things go. In the choice to fight one battle, knowing it was part of a larger war. He thought about his father, who had once told him that the hardest part of fighting injustice wasn't the resistance from those in power, it was the exhaustion. It was the temptation to let things slide, to pick your battles, to convince yourself that some fights weren't worth the energy. But that was how injustice thrived. Not because of those who wielded it, but because of those who learned to live with it. He wasn't interested in learning to live with it. By noon, the wheels were in motion. The story had been leaked to a journalist he trusted, a woman who had spent years exposing racial bias in law enforcement. By 2, a local news station had picked it up, running the headline, "TSA under fire after civil rights attorney detained without cause." The article laid it out clean and sharp, documenting not only Marcus' experience but the complaints before the judge who had filed, the policies that allowed it to happen in the first place. The calls started soon after. A request for a televised interview. A legal analyst asking for a quote. People wanted the story. They wanted the fight. And Marcus was ready to give it to them. He sat in front of his laptop, staring at the cursor blinking on the screen as he typed his response. "We are not obligated to accept the way things are. We are not powerless to change them. The moment we stop challenging injustice is the moment we accept it as truth. I refuse." He hit send. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The world moves fast when a story catches fire. It spreads like wind rushing through dry fields, unstoppable, relentless, jumping from screen to screen, mouth to mouth. By the time Marcus stepped into his office the next morning, the case had already slipped beyond his control, not in a chaotic way, but in the way movements do when they take on a life of their own. It was no longer just about him. It was about the judge who had filed a complaint before him, the businessman in Atlanta who had written a blog post about missing a flight for the same reason, the mother in Houston who had emailed his firm overnight with a story about her teenage son being pulled aside and questioned for 30 minutes while white travelers walked past without a glance. It was about a pattern, one that had been there long before Marcus had missed his flight, long before Willis had stood in that security line with his clipboard and his smirk, convinced that no one would ever challenge him. Ava had already beaten him to the office, her desk covered in stacks of legal filings, notes scribbled in red ink, a half-empty coffee cup pushed to the side. She didn't even look up when he walked in. "CNN called," she said, flipping a page. "They want you on air tonight. Primetime. I told them we'd get back to them." Marcus dropped his bag onto the chair and exhaled, rolling his sleeves up past his elbows. "Good." She glanced at him now, sharp-eyed, assessing. "You ready for this?" He nodded, but they both knew it wasn't about whether he was ready. It was happening. The only question was how he would handle it. By noon, more statements had come out, civil rights organizations condemning the TSA's actions, local politicians calling for an independent review, the agency itself releasing the standard non-apology. "We take these matters seriously and are conducting an internal investigation." The kind of statement that meant nothing. The kind designed to make people forget. But Marcus wasn't interested in forgetting. The first lawsuit was filed before the sun went down. A class action suit naming not just Willis but the department that had enabled him, the policies that had shielded him. The press release went out minutes later. The fight had officially left the airport and entered the courtroom, where Marcus was strongest. That night, as he sat under the bright studio lights of the CNN set, microphone clipped to his collar, the anchor across from him reading off the details of his case. Marcus thought about every time he had been told to pick his battles. Every time someone had said, "That's just the way things are." He had never accepted that answer, and he wasn't going to start now. "So, Marcus," the anchor said, leaning in, voice measured, practiced, "what do you say to the people who believe this was just an unfortunate incident, that it had nothing to do with race, that it was simply bad luck?" Marcus let the question settle for a moment, let the weight of it fill the space between them. Then he looked directly into the camera, past the lens, past the newsroom, past the thousands of people watching from their homes, and said, "I say that bad luck doesn't have a pattern." The studio went silent. Then, as if on cue, the world started moving even faster. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old battles. The air carried the weight of arguments made and lost, of verdicts that had sent men home and others to their knees. Marcus Hayes had spent years standing behind podiums like this, his voice carving through silence like a chisel against stone. But this time, the case wasn't about someone else. It was about him. It was about all the people who had come before him and all the ones who would come after, the ones who had been stopped, questioned, delayed, dismissed, and told that it was nothing, that it was just a misunderstanding, a standard procedure, bad luck. But bad luck didn't have a pattern. And now, standing in front of a judge, flanked by Ava on one side and a growing movement on the other, Marcus was here to make sure that truth had nowhere to hide. The opening arguments had been made, the legal groundwork laid out like a blueprint. TSA's lawyers had tried to keep it simple. Their client followed protocol, did his job, made a judgment call based on security concerns. But Marcus knew how to dismantle a defense like that. He had built his career on it. He had spent years studying the way power protected itself, the way language could be molded to make injustice look like an accident. He wasn't interested in accidents. He was interested in accountability. The first witness was called Agent Tran, the officer who had stood by that day, watching as Willis pulled Marcus aside, her face tight with hesitation. She had not wanted to testify. She had spent weeks convincing herself it wasn't her fight, that speaking up could cost her more than it was worth. But silence, she had realized, was a form of consent. And so she sat there, hands folded in her lap, voice steady but soft, as she recounted the way Willis had let others pass through. How Marcus had asked again and again for an explanation. How she had known, even in that moment, that this was wrong. TSA's attorney tried to rattle her. "Are you saying Agent Willis acted with racial bias?" Tran hesitated, glancing at Marcus, then back at the attorney. "I'm saying he didn't stop anyone else. I'm saying he made a choice, and it wasn't based on security." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Next came the data. Cases laid out in cold numbers. How often black travelers were pulled for extra screening. How long their delays lasted compared to others. How, time and time again, the excuses given didn't line up with the facts. Patterns. Irrefutable, undeniable, unavoidable. Willis took the stand, stiff in his uniform, face carefully blank. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had spent his life in unquestioned authority, who had never had to explain himself before. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said. "I don't regret following protocol." Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, walked toward him with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew exactly where this was going. "Protocol," he repeated, letting the words settle in the room. "Would you say it was protocol to allow the other travelers through without a second glance?" Willis shifted slightly in his chair. "I made a judgment call." Marcus tilted his head. "A judgment call based on what?" Willis exhaled sharply, his gaze flicking toward the judge. "I don't recall." "You don't recall?" Marcus let a small pause stretch, then reached for the incident report. "This is the form you filled out after detaining me. You noted suspicious behavior. Can you clarify what that was?" Willis swallowed. No sudden movements. No raised voice. Nothing in my bag. Nothing in my scan. No alarm triggered. And yet you detained me. For what?" Willis opened his mouth, then closed it. Marcus nodded slightly. "That's what I thought." The jury watched, some leaning forward, some glancing at one another. It was happening. The moment where power found itself without a place to hide. By the time closing arguments were made, the weight in the room had shifted. TSA's defense had crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The evidence was clear. The intent, whether spoken aloud or carried in a lifetime of unchecked authority, was clear. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. TSA was found liable. Agent Willis was dismissed from his position. A national review of racial bias in airport security was ordered. And Marcus Hayes, for all he had lost, walked out of that courthouse knowing that for once, the system had bent toward justice. Outside, the crowd was waiting: reporters, activists, people who had been following the case, people who had stories of their own, stories of missed flights and missed opportunities, of being told again and again that what had happened to them was just an inconvenience, not a violation. Marcus stepped to the microphone, looked at the sea of faces before him, and spoke not just for himself, but for all of them. This isn't about one case. It's about a pattern that has been ignored for too long, justified for too long, excused for too long. Today, we sent a message that no one is above accountability, that the rights of every person matter, no matter what they look like, no matter what someone assumes about them. And we're not done, because this is just the beginning. And as the cameras flashed, as his words carried out into the world, Marcus knew that he was right. This wasn't the end. It was never the end. Because justice, real justice, was never just about one victory. It was about making sure the fight never had to be fought again. The airport looked different this time. Not because the walls had changed or the floors had been polished or the voices on the intercom had softened, but because Marcus Hayes had changed. He walked through the terminal, past the same security lines, past the same TSA uniforms, past the same quiet calculations that happened behind watchful eyes. But this time, no one stopped him. No one pulled him aside. No one asked him to step out of line or empty his bag or spread his fingers wide like a suspect. It wasn't because they had suddenly learned to see him differently. It was because he had forced them to. Change never happens all at once. It moves in ripples, in slow, stubborn waves that break down walls grain by grain. Policy rewritten. A resignation tendered. A new training program implemented. A name added to a national list of cases that should have never had to be fought in the first place. The case had made headlines for weeks, but Marcus knew how quickly the news cycle moved on. How easily the world could return to business as usual. That was why he was here, not just to prove a point, but to remind himself and everyone watching that justice doesn't end with a verdict. Continues in what happens next. As he made his way toward his gate, he saw Agent Tran at a nearby checkpoint. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a small nod, not one of apology, but of recognition. She had spoken up when it mattered. She had stepped forward when silence would have been easier. And in doing so, she had helped push the wheel a little further forward. He returned the nod, then kept walking. Ava had warned him to take a break, to slow down after everything that had happened, but Marcus knew himself too well. He wasn't built for slowing down. There were other cases to fight, other battles waiting, and he had no intention of sitting still. The lawsuit had been just one piece of the puzzle, one strike against a system that had spent decades perfecting the art of pretending bias was just a coincidence. But the real fight was always bigger than one man, one flight, one courtroom. It was about making sure no one else had to stand where he stood. It was about ensuring that the next time someone like him walked into an airport, they wouldn't have to brace themselves for what was coming. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Ava. "Call me when you land. I've got something for you." He smirked, shaking his head. The work never stopped, and honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. As the plane began to board, he stepped forward, handing his ticket to the attendant. She scanned it, smiled. "Have a great flight, Mr. Hayes." And for the first time in a long time, he believed he just might.